Greetings everyone and welcome to chapter 3. I created the PowerPoint slides for this chapter and my objective is to try to cover the chapter with you by bringing some content as well from the internet. So let's get started. I want you to look at the slide on the first cover here for competing in the marketplace, and go ahead and pause the video and look at the map and see what you notice about the map. Go ahead and pause the video, and when you're ready, start again. Alright, so by now what you probably have noticed is that, of course, the map doesn't look like a regular world map. I really like this particular map because what it does is it shows a map of the countries as represented by the population in each country. And what it does show you is that, of course, China is the biggest, right, with 1.4, almost 1.5 billion people. India number 2 at 1.354. By the way, within the next 5 to 10 years, the population of India will be greater than that of China. That has to do with the one-child policy of China, and now there's more growth and birth in India than in China. And then, of course, when you look at the U.S. at 326.8, we are the third largest country in the world, but it gives you a little bit of perspective, right? And by the way, remember that if you look at an actual map and what it really does look like, you will see that India is measurably smaller than the United States. Over here I have a hyperlink if you want to click on that, and that's a hyperlink to the actual textbook online. Alright, let's get going. So, global trade in the U.S., and I'm following your online book on this. Why is global trade important to the U.S. and how is it measured? Well, that's why I wanted to start with that map. I wanted to give you kind of an idea as to what the world really does look like. There's about 7 billion people on planet Earth, and remember that here in 2018 there's a 326.8 million Americans. So again, the idea is there's the world, that's what it looks like. To what extent do you want to take advantage of the growth that's outside of your border? And if you choose not to do that, remember that your competitor might be doing that, and you will be left behind. So that's what's happening there. Let's see. Oh, by the way, that also let me tell you this. This takes you to the first chapter, and after that, I'll let you guys figure it out. So why is global trade important to the U.S.? So we talked about that. No longer just an option. Having a global vision has become a business imperative. And so this is the idea that, what the smart companies are doing is taking advantage of that growth, recognizing and reacting. I don't even really like that word. I know this is intro to business, it's not global business, but usually the best cases and the best examples are of companies being proactive, not reacting. To international business opportunities, being aware of the threats from foreign competitors in all markets, and effectively using international distribution network to obtain raw material and move finished products to the customer. We're seeing a lot of that right now with the tariffs that were just imposed recently by the White House. A lot of people have kind of a rather simplistic notion of trade. Case in point is just a car part that maybe comes from Mexico. People have an idea that, okay, this is a car part, it's made in Mexico, it's going to be brought into the US, and if we want to slap a 10% tariff on Mexico to try to bring the job back to the US, that's it. Well, not so fast. What you'll find is because of the logistics and the way that our distribution networks are set up, that part might actually travel back and forth between Mexico and the US 3, 4, 5 times. It'll start in Mexico, get back to the US where we'll modify it, send it back to Mexico, they modify it. Anyway, there's more than one step per part. And so in this case, by the time you're done, the part goes up 50%. So anyway, that's just kind of a little food for thought. Over the past 30 years, world trade has climbed from $200 billion a year to more than $1.4 trillion. US companies play a huge role in that, with 113 of the Fortune 500 making 50% of the profit outside the US. So just think about that for a second. Again, we'll talk about the trade war and the tariffs in a little bit, but take Caterpillar, for example. Caterpillar, they make earth movers, farm equipment, etc. And if you want to slap a tariff on foreign steel, well, remember that it takes a lot of steel to make a Caterpillar. Caterpillar wants cheap foreign steel so that it can be competitive in the global arena. But now I'm forcing it to buy American steel, more expensive steel. That might be great for American steel producers, but it might not be great for Caterpillar when it tries to export its equipment outside the United States and can no longer compete with its competitors. So I hope I'm not going too fast. Please pause if you need to. Let's see, can you guess what percentage of sales Coca-Cola makes outside the US? So maybe hit pause for a second, just kind of think about it. And then when you come back, you'll have your answer. All right, so here it is. This is from Coca-Cola. It's the latest one I could find, 2017 annual report. And it shows you that not even the US, but North America, that's less than a quarter actually. That's 20%, right? And we're talking about revenue. And so that really kind of truly shows you that, of course, Coca-Cola is a multinational corporation. It has a global footprint, and therefore what happens outside the United States affects the revenue of Coca-Cola. Just again, using a product that I think everybody's familiar with. So what's the importance of global business to the United States? So we're starting there. Many countries depend more on international commerce than the US does. So if you think about our gross domestic product, the American GDP, this is where you can see that 28% of our GDP is made up of dependence on trade. And the example from your author is that some other countries are relying over 50% of their GDP on trade. Trade is going to matter. Since the US only derives 28% of its GDP, it should be off of its GDP from trade. This is a question for you guys. Can you guess where the US ranks in the world as a net exporter? So just think about that question. A very small percentage of our GDP is composed of trade, right? China over 50%, Germany over 50%, Japan over 50%, etc. So considering that only 28% of our gross domestic product is trade, just try to guess. There's about 200 countries on the planet. Try to guess where the US ranks. So go ahead and pause the video and just think about that question. And then when you're ready, hit play. All right, here you go. So this is a really cool, another map that shows you the size of the country based on total value of export, not just import-export, but actual export. So the US, that actually, you hear this a lot in the news and media from politicians, the US doesn't make stuff anymore, etc. We're actually number 2 on the planet. We're the second largest exporter of goods on the planet at 1.5 trillion, right? Because this is in billions, so that's $1.5 trillion worth of export. And that puts us number 2 behind China, 2.2, and actually puts us ahead of Germany. And remember what I just told you, over 50% of the GDP of Germany is trade. All right, measuring trade between nations. So international trade improves relationships with friends and allies, helps ease tensions among nations, economically speaking, bolsters economies, raises people's standard of living. Just think about the stuff you have. How are you watching this video right now? Using your phone, or using your tablet, your computer? Where was that thing made? Where are the components coming from? And that's all because of trade, right? There's a podcast on Marketplace. If you want to Google, it's quite interesting. If you Google Marketplace podcast, cost of iPhone made in the US. Basically, they asked a bunch of people, what if an iPhone was made in the US, will be the cost? Well, the answer is it would be unaffordable. And not only that, it would bankrupt Apple because they would never be able to sell it outside the US. It would be too expensive. The value of international trade is over $16 trillion a year and growing. So this section takes a look at some key measures of trade. This is a cool map again, well, I think it's cool, of the world shifting trade winds, right? So it's showing you, Russia, what they're exporting, there's oil, there's different types of things here, electronics. So who's exporting what to whom and what's going on? So the US over here, yes, we're bringing tons of stuff from Japan, from China, etc., but we're also exporting a lot throughout the world, right? So it gives you an idea. All right, measuring trade between nations. Here we're going to go with basic definitions. Exports, goods and services made in one country that you export elsewhere. Imports, just the opposite of that. The difference between what you import and your export is called a balance of trade. If you have a positive balance of trade, you have a trade surplus. Some people call it a favorable balance of trade or a positive balance of trade. That means you export more stuff than you import, which is what our current administration is really pursuing, by the way. So, that sounds great on paper, it's fantastic, but we'll talk about the unintended consequences of that. Unfavorable balance of trade is a trade deficit, and that's when you import more than you export, which is what we have. When imports exceed exports, more money from trade flows out of the country. So that's the thing that looks really horrible. Just keep in mind that because of interdependence, what we export, to make the stuff we export, we have to import a bunch of stuff. So the first thing you want to think about. Second thing you want to think about is last time we had a big global recession. Countries that were more dependent on trade for their GDP were the ones that suffered the most. All right, why nations trade? So here, for those of you who took econ, maybe you remember this from your econ class. A country that has an absolute advantage is a country that can produce and sell a product at lower cost than any other country, or when it's the only country that can provide a product. I think it's coltan, right? I don't know if you guys heard of that. Let's see if I can find out. Coltan mining countries. So coltan is a component. It's an ore that is mined and that goes in your phone. And it's lately kind of shown up to be in the news because the Central African Republic, CAR, is one of those countries that mines a lot of coltan, and some of the groups criminal groups have decided to go in and mine there. So this is coltan mining and ethics right there. So what are the human rights, etc., etc., the mining economic development of coltan. Democratic Republic of the sorry, not CAR. I was wrong. It's the the Republic of the Congo, and Nigeria, Brazil, China. All these countries here mine coltan, and so if you think about this ore, it's very valuable, and so these countries they have an absolute advantage over other countries that don't produce it because there you go. Now, having said that, if you have two countries that trade, right, and that's the example that your author is using here, is even if the U.S., let's pretend, has an absolute advantage in both coffee and air traffic control, should it still basically buy it from someone else? So just think about that question for a second. Let's say you have a country A, country B, and they both, grow, I don't know, avocados and papaya, right? But country A, you can use less resources for papaya and for avocados than country A. So the idea is, should country B buy from country A if country A is not as good? And the answer is yes, because then it can focus its resources on between papaya and avocados, the one resource it's better at making than the other, right? So this is the idea of comparative advantage. Absolute advantage was developed by Adam Smith, and comparative advantage was developed by David Ricardo, both economists. I have a little video here if you want to click on it that walks you through. Obviously, this PowerPoint slide will be posted for you guys on the canvas. For some reason, looks there we go. So let's see, make sure that it works. But there we go. So this is from Investopedia, which is a site that I use occasionally. Oops. Make sure you guys can all see that. There we go. So if you scroll down a little bit and you click here, there's a video that will walk you through and explain comparative advantage in a way that's really straightforward, because you have two guys out there that are baking, and it kind of gives you the idea of like one is better at baking than the other, etc., etc. And what if they actually trade with each other? How much money could they make? So just kind of I think a very straightforward, not complicated way of understanding comparative advantage. If you haven't taken econ, you'll have to learn that in macro, and so this you'll have a leg up on that. All right, let's keep moving. So, having said that, there's a lot of fear out there, between different countries on trade and globalization. Again, most economists and business students understand that trade is a boon. Because of trade, we're able to get things cheaper and we have greater choices, right? Think about capitalism. Competition is good, and so you have a lot of people enter the same market and they want to penetrate the market. They want to have greater market share, and it's going to make them work harder to try to come up with a good or better product that's cheaper, etc. And so, now on the other hand, when you have an economy that starts to kind of slow down, there's a lot of reports out there that are pointing to an imminent recession in the United States this year or next year, maybe next year. The Economist, Financial Times, all pretty reputable, are pointing to next year or the year after. Anyway, what it does is it creates fear when people worry about losing their jobs, etc. And often, when they're fearful, they point the finger at importers. If we didn't import cars from China or Japan or Mexico, then more Americans would make cars. It sounds absolutely true, right? The only problem with that is that, of course, if you think about how much it costs to make a car in the US versus, say, Mexico, and you know that in Mexico it costs 1/10 to make a car, just remember this. The idea that we can start slapping tariffs on cars from Mexico is a little bit naive, and maybe only works as long as you're willing to tell this manufacturer in the United States that they're not going to be able to export those cars outside the region, right? Anyway, there's a lot of unintended consequences that you'll learn more about when you take the global business class. All right, the fear in trade. Continued protests during the World Trade Organizations. So there's a lot of stuff out there about people protesting. The book has a highlight on it. I always find it fascinating to see these little protesters out there protesting the WTO, World Trade Organization, IMF. And I always like to see what they're wearing. And they're wearing Nike, and they're wearing Levi's, and they're using little smartphones, etc. All products that they were able to afford because of globalization. All right, the negatives of global trade. Yes, jobs will be lost. And so this is where you have to decide, if you think about the greater good, right? What industries are you willing to protect and subsidize, right? And so if the government decides it's going to be protectionistic specifically with one industry, there's always unintended consequence. I kind of touched on that earlier with the idea of Caterpillar being forced to buy more expensive American steel, no longer has access to cheap foreign steel, and Caterpillar is currently hurting. Same thing with anybody who makes anything that requires steel, because their costs went up. And as we discussed earlier, if you're going to be part of the global economy, and maybe you're going to export 50%, 75%, or even 30% of your product outside the United States, you will no longer be competitive if you're forced to export a more expensive product because you were forced to buy a more expensive resource due to protectionism. So that's the fear there. Millions of others fear losing their jobs, those in companies operating under competitive pressure. So employers feel threatened to export jobs if workers don't accept pay cuts. That's a reality, and it's unfair to the workers. What you find over time is that things evolve, right? And so to what extent do you want to protect those jobs? Think farming. To what extent do you want to protect some of the farming jobs that were rendered irrelevant because of technology, right? So there's a displacement, and you always have to ask yourself, to what extent do I let progress be progress, and to what extent do I protect? It's a tough question because, of course, it sounds great until you're the guy who's losing the job. So it's a very fair point to make that, you want to ask what can be done for the people who are about to lose those jobs. Often training or retraining or training in a different industry is the way to go. We have a shortage of nurses in this country. I know it sounds kind of maybe silly to some of you, but if somebody's working making cars on an assembly line and they're willing to go to local community college and be a nurse, they will find a job as a nurse, guaranteed. So service and white collar jobs are increasingly vulnerable to operations moving offshore. Again, we talked about that. When you send something offshore to another country, it's called outsourcing. Please, if I'm going too fast, hit pause, take some notes. Okay, what are the benefits of globalization? We touched on that, right? So this interdependence. Think about these components out there, and if you think about just something as simple as your smartphone or your tablet, even your car is made from components maybe from over 100 countries. And it sounds insane if you think about it. Wait a second. Doesn't trade between all of these countries drive up the price of the car? Well, actually, it's the opposite. And the reason it's the opposite is not just because of cost of labor, etc. It's because of something called specialization, where each country specializes. Let me give you an example. Let's see. There is a German manufacturer of car parts called Magna. They used to be called Getrag. And Magna, you probably have that product in your car and might not even realize that you do. So it was Getrag in 2018, and it's the world's largest supplier of transmissions for passenger cars. And so if you think about the car that you drive right now, these are all the cars with these German transmissions, right? So of course lots of BMWs, and then there's a Cadillac, there's Jaguar, some brands that exist in Europe, Opel, Mercedes-Benz. Anyway, it is insane when you start to think about all of the brands that have this German transmission, right? And look at where they make those transmissions. Look at all the countries, right? So really a huge global footprint. And so having said all that, you probably most likely have that transmission in your car. Now, having said that, you benefit from that. Why? Because in this particular case, this company has specialized in making transmission. It's the global leader. So that means the quality is just unsurpassed. Because they want to save money also, they're going to use what's called lean manufacturing, which means that it'll be cheaper to make the transmission. So what are we saying? You're buying a transmission that's world-class, best in its class, but also that might even be the cheapest. And so that's the benefit of the globalization there. Anyway, hopefully I'm giving you enough for you to chew on with this chapter. Global competition and cheap imports keep prices down. So we talked about that. Inflation is less likely to stop economic growth. However, in some cases, it doesn't work. Why? Because some countries manipulate their currency. So I highlighted that because on the next slide, I have a little clip about that to kind of explain what that is. China gets accused of that. And, in the past, maybe yes, and now it is actually manipulating currency. But that's because, and I know hopefully it's not sounding too complicated, but the way that China is counteracting the tariff that we slapped on China is by lowering its currency deliberately. Let me explain. If I tell China, look, from now on, when you want to export this product to my market, to the United States, it's going to cost you an extra 10%. So of course it's making the product more expensive, and China then might think, oh no, if my product is more expensive, then they're not going to buy it. They're going to buy a cheaper product, maybe American, Canadian, whatever. But then China has an option. Oh, okay, fine. So you're going to charge 10% extra on this product. I know what I'll do. I'll weaken my currency by 10%, and then the price will remain the same. So that kind of trade barrier that we've created with China right now is kind of leading China to further manipulate its currency and weaken it, making the tariff maybe even a moot point. All right, open economy spurs innovation. I always use the example of the iPhone. Think about how many apps were created with that thing. Think about the healthcare industry using Apple iPads, tablets, transportation, logistics. I mean, think about just those inventions and what they helped create trillions of dollars by the end of it in all kinds of other industries. All right, so through infusion of foreign capital and technology, global trade provides poor countries with a chance to develop economically by spreading prosperity. So when there's innovation, when a country allows its people with research and development or education to come up with better products, that country then gets to boost its economy by being part of other trade blocs and trade patterns. All right, let's move along. So this was a little clip that I loaded here. I'll let you watch this on your own, but it's a little clip that looks like eventually it should play. There we go. So if you just click on this, you'll have a story from CNBC. That's again, I found this, I like this one because it's very, very straightforward. It's kind of a nice way to understand currency manipulation. All right, barriers to trade. Now, there's different barriers to trade. The first barrier to trade is actually a physical barrier. Think a mountain, think distance. The example here from your author is beef from Argentina exported to Europe, right? Argentina, South America, going all the way to Europe. And so the cost of shipping the stuff brings up the price of beef. We could reverse that with American beef going to South Korea. South Korea is a huge consumer of beef. And not too long ago, South Korea had a tariff on American beef until the United States, with the previous administration, created something called KORUS, K-O-R-U-S. And KORUS is a trade agreement between the United States and South Korea that helped actually beef producers export their beef to South Korea without paying extra tariffs, etc. Which takes me to the next barrier, which is a tariff barrier, right? And so we call that, by the way, an artificial barrier. So the first one is a natural barrier, and anything that's basically not a natural barrier, we call it artificial barrier. And a tariff barrier is a tax. Just think of it as a tax. I used the example earlier of that. If you click on this hyperlink, you will see about the current administration slapping tariffs on China and what that means to us consumers, etc. Non-tariff barriers. So you guys have heard of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's in the chapter. We'll talk about it in a little bit. The North American Free Trade Agreement basically mandates that there's an agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico where we agree to disagree and not slap tariffs on each other, right? Well, sometimes we think like, wait, hold on, Mexico. You're really trying to export those delicious avocados to the United States. And we also grow avocados in California. And so what if we want to protect our California avocado growers? We can't really slap a tariff on them. So maybe what we'll do is we'll say, okay, Mexico, guess what? From now on, you can't export as many avocados as you used to. And so think supply and demand, etc. And by forcing Mexico to decrease its export of avocados into the United States, I am like basically almost creating a tariff, right? Except it's not a tariff, but I'm forcing the price of avocados to go up just by economics of supply and demand. Let's see. For those of you who like avocados, I'm one of them, by the way. You will let's see, like this image, if I can find it quickly. There we go. So this is I love this chart. This chart here is a chart that shows you. Give me a second. Sorry about that. I should have thought about having that earlier for you guys. Except this is great. Here we go. All right. So okay, just did a quick Google search and it popped up a second ago, but now it's gone. Oh no. That's too bad. All right. Well, they talk about the chart, but I guess they don't show it. The Great Global Agri Trade Flow chart. So it's a cool chart that shows you, if you want to Google it, just go Global Avocado Trade, and you will see that Mexico is an undisputed champion of the world when it comes to trading avocados. All right, I think we're good with this, so let's move along to the next one. So fostering global trade, right? How do government institutions foster trade? So there's all kinds of things we do. So dumping, let's start with dumping. It's if you want to export a product to another country, and let's say that you want to penetrate the product, the market share, and you're afraid that, oh, well, if I just even try to make 3% interest revenue on the product, I might not be able to compete because I'll still be a little bit cheaper than my competitor, but might not be enough because they never heard my brand. Aha, what if I could come in the market and my product is 20% cheaper? All right, well, if I did that, I would actually not make a profit. I would lose money. But it might not be a horrible idea if it means that I corner the market, right? So maybe in the short term, I don't know, 3 months, 6 months, I'm willing to take the hit. And if I'm a big multinational, I can do that no problem. And export the thing to another country, take the hit financially, and destroy my competition, right? So that's called dumping, right? Dumping is the practice of charging a lower price for a product in a foreign market. We have anti-dumping laws in the United States, meaning that if somebody tries to do that, Department of Justice, we actually complain to the World Trade Organization, and if we find them guilty, then they have to pay us a fee, blah, blah, blah. So I just talked about the World Trade Organization replaces GATT, General Agreement Tariffs to Trade, which was created just after World War II. GATT was an agreement among the signatory countries, the allies after World War II, that after experiencing World War I and World War II, and what led to the war, among other things, was massive recession leading to economic depression, and a lot of that created because of trade wars, they decided, well, let's create a general agreement tariff and trade where we agree to disagree and not slap each other with tariffs. That was great, but it kind of only went so far, and eventually we created the World Trade Organization and got, the GATT became the foundation for that. So if you have a complaint, you go to GATT, right? Let's see what that looks like. This is really cool. So this is a trade dispute map of GATT, WTO signatories who basically get to complain to the World Trade about each other. So if I click on Chile, for example, right here, right now, this is what Chile looks like in terms of what's going on there. If I click on Mexico, this is showing you what's going on there. Let's see. I'll give you a second. It's not actually the map I was looking for. There's a map that shows us trade wars between the other two. It's a trade dispute map. That's why I couldn't find it. Sorry about that, you guys. I thought I had it already. So it's a trade dispute map. Let's just Google it real quick. WTO disputes. There we go. And so there's a really cool interactive map. Kind of looks like that, the one I just showed you. And can't believe I'm doing this live. I'm just killing it right now. Let's see. All right, so there we go. So this is a map of disputes between So this map's going to look different eventually when it pops up. It's a really cool map because now, okay, remember I was showing you Chile earlier. So now, come on. It's not happening today. It's frozen. All right, I apologize. If you want to do map of disputes between WTO members, it'll pop up. Apologies, people. The World Bank offers low-interest loans to developing nations. So this is where I'm going to ask you to make sure that you understand the difference between the World Bank and the IMF. The IMF is one of the biggest institutions on the planet. So the World Bank is not to be confused with that, even though it has the word bank in it. When you think about World Bank, first of all, our definition offers low-interest loans to developing nations. So think about a very poor country, people are starving, there's a drought, and the World Bank's usually going to kick in some money, food, grain, etc. to help the people along, to help these nations build infrastructure, roads, power plants, etc. The IMF is a different beast. Right after World War II again, 1945 is the end of World War II. 1 year after the creation of the World Bank to promote through financial cooperation, eliminate trade barriers in the process. They make short-term loans to member nations that are unable to meet their budgetary expenses. So the difference here is that the IMF is designed to help along usually developed countries who are struggling. And right now there is one like that, and that is Argentina. Argentina is having real issues. I don't know if you guys are following, but poverty has risen 32% from 26%, and the 45% inflation rate is the main reason why. Argentina is in a crisis. And so, again, I'll make all of this available to you so you can watch the videos on your own. But the IMF is going to have to kick in again. The IMF is going to probably, this is a country here receiving one of the largest IMF financial support programs any country ever has. So the IMF already tried to help Argentina, but it's been a problem, and Argentina is still having issues. All right, international economic communities. Now, for those of you who have taken global business or who will in the future, we usually call those trade blocks, BLOC, trade blocks. And, the idea is really straightforward. If you think about the United States, right? In fact, let me ask you guys, historically, who do you think has been the US's top trade partner in terms of our exports? If you think about, earlier I showed you, we're the second largest exporter on the planet. Think about who buys most of our stuff. Who historically has bought more of our stuff? What country? So hit pause if you want, and then think about that. All right, if you've given it some thought, it is Canada. Canada has been one of our best friends for many, many years. And so a lot of people are surprised by that. But if you think about what tends to happen in trade, usually two things. You will go with the country that's culturally more like you, but also geographically closest to you. So in this case, it makes a lot of sense historically that Canada has been our top trade partner. Geography tends to play the biggest role in trade for obvious reasons. Germany's number one trade partner is France. France's number one trade partner is Germany, they're neighbors, and they're both the two largest economies in continental Europe. Anyway, you get the idea. So now we've got these trade blocks, right? And the biggest trade block on the planet is the North American Free Trade Agreement between Canada, the US, and Mexico. It's not the best, if you want to call it that. And the reason it's not the best is because it's just a trade agreement. It's a contract. It's a piece of paper. And we agree to disagree on some stuff, and we don't always agree. There's all of these, that little trade dispute map that I was going to show you earlier. We have big fights with Mexico and Canada as we speak. The European Union, Mercosur is another one. So Mercosur is a South American trade bloc or economic community. Includes Peru, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. There's a little bit of drama going on there. There's been countries that have got booted out. Venezuela used to be a member, very important member because of its oil, but of course Venezuela now is in a crisis and got kicked out. The EU is probably the most significant trade bloc on the planet. Why? Well, because the European Union is more than a trade agreement, right? It's an economic union, which means that the difference is that, imagine for a second, imagine this. If NAFTA was like the EU, here's what it would mean. Maybe we get rid of the Federal Reserve of the United States, and instead there's a Federal Reserve, let's say in Canada, and Canada controls one currency. We know that we get rid of the dollar. We have a new currency, currency A, and that currency is traded in Canada, the US, and Mexico. We all use the same currency, and the central bank is no longer in the US, it is in Canada. So just think about that first of all. Second thing, we get rid of all the borders, which we're kind of doing the opposite. We're building a wall right now with Mexico. What the European Union did is all these member nations got rid of borders. So if you want to drive from Germany to France to Spain, all that, you just drive right through. If you're in Germany, you're on the Autobahn, and going from Germany to the Czech Republic, you're literally driving as fast as you want right through the border. No more borders. Jobs. People can work, just pick up and go work. A German person who wants to go to Spain can just find a job in Spain. They don't need a special permit or anything. So that's the European Union. It's a definite, I just want to make sure you understand it is not a trade agreement. All right, Brexit. I did a little Brexit update over here. Brexit is not mentioned in your book as much, but it's England is leaving the European Union, right? It's in the process as we speak. It's been very contentious. So if you think about what that means, I wanted to kind of share with you a little video of the German, I don't know, you guys know maybe the Daily Show, and so he is the equivalent of the Daily Show in Germany. He's a comedian, but kind of does a lot of political stuff. And this is how Germans feel about England leaving the European Union through Brexit, right? Just a little taste. Yes, it's subtitled.
Ja, herzlich willkommen, liebe Zuschauer, zur letzten Heute-Show des Jahres, beziehungsweise Kenner der Sendung wissen das, zur traditionellen Verleihung des Goldenen Vollpfosten 2018. Und ich schlage vor, den ersten hauen wir gleich mal ohne Vorrede raus. Er geht aus aktuellem Anlass und hochverdient an Großbritannien, die verwirrteste Insel der Welt. Ja. Ich weiß nicht, wie es Ihnen geht, ich kann nur sagen, es ist nicht mehr auszuhalten. Inzwischen wissen die Briten gar nicht mehr, was sie wollen. Entscheidet euch mal, oder wie ihr sagen würdet, Essig bei die Fische, jetzt mal ehrlich. Ja. Zählen Sie mal zusammen, jetzt hat Theresa May in nur einer Woche die Abstimmung über den Deal mit der EU verschoben, ein Misstrauensvotum überlebt und sie war auch noch auf Battletour in Europa. Hier symptomatische Bilder aus Berlin. May kommt einfach nicht mehr raus, weder aus der EU noch aus ihrem blöden Auto. Ja, kann man erklären, ist ein Mercedes, der hat eine Engländersicherung. Das ist also nur.
All right. Anyway, you can watch the rest on your own. There's the Germans are, and a lot of Europeans are kind of a little bit what's happening with England leaving the European Union. Think about who is England's number one trade partner. It is the European Union. And so England wants its cake and eat it too. It wants to leave the European Union, but it wants to trade with the European Union. And of course, it doesn't want to pay extra. It doesn't want any tariffs. It doesn't need quotas, nothing like that. But if you're on the other side of that, if you're a Spaniard or a German person, etc., and you're looking at that and you're thinking like, whoa, hold on a second. We have to make concessions, right? We have to let the Central Bank of Europe control our currency. They lost sovereignty. So, for example, Spain, if it has a problem, it can't just, play around with the interest rate because that's all controlled by the Central Bank of Europe, the ECB. So there's a lot of concession and some loss of sovereignty made by these countries that have decided to join in on this experiment. And they're, very resentful that, hey, this England, if you want to leave, leave, but don't ask us for any favor. So that's what's going on there. It's playing out as we speak. All right. So participating in the global marketplace, I think I don't need to tell you too much about what exporting is. A country makes a good, exports it somewhere else. If you're, have a small business and you're thinking about exporting, sba.gov, and also export.gov is fantastic as a resource to help you export. A lot of these resources are free. Licensing. When you export a product, the problem is, think about the tariffs, for example, right? So if there's a little trade war or something going on, well, you're not exporting anymore because people are not going to buy your product because your product's too expensive. And so what's a way around that? A licensing agreement might be a way around that. So here you have our definition, a legal process whereby the firm agrees to let another firm use a manufacturing process, trademark, etc. Nike is a great example of that. A lot of people think that Nike makes shoes. Well, it's a little bit more interesting than that. Nike doesn't make shoes really. Nike designs shoes, and Nike has licensing agreements with a bunch of factories and all over the world who will make the shoes at the behest of Nike, and sometimes with their own twist on it, as long as they meet some key requirement. And so that's a licensing agreement. A franchising agreement, by the way, is also a licensing agreement. That's why they're both here. I'm not trying to confuse you, but of course, everybody thinks McDonald's. McDonald's is a franchise. You never own the store, right? It belongs to McDonald's. You're kind of like renting it out, and you have to pay them a cut. All right, contract manufacturing. Foreign firm manufactures private label goods. Here's an example from your author of Levi Strauss, the pants. Entered into an agreement with French fashion house Cacharel to produce a new Levi's line, something new, for distribution in Germany. I mean, it's fascinating, right? You have an American big company, Levi's. I was going to call it multinational, but not quite yet. It's still privately held. Actually, they traded recently. They're not doing great. Entered an agreement with a French fashion house to produce something in Germany. There's globalization for you. Another way you could go is a joint venture, right? So think General Electric. Next time you're in an airplane going somewhere, and let's say it's a Boeing, and you might be wondering, like, oh, Boeing makes airplanes, right? Yeah, Boeing assembles airplanes with parts that come from all over the world. And the biggest producer of jet engines is General Electric, right? Now, there's a European company that also makes jet engines, Safran, which is a French company, that's also very popular. And they decided that they could work together on making an engine together under a new name. And so the company is right here, is CFM International, right? And that's GE and Safran building jet engines together at CFM. So we call that a joint venture. A joint venture is two companies creating a third together. Just so you know, it's not going to be on the test, don't worry. A strategic alliance is when two companies decide to work together, but they don't create a third company. Very popular, a lot of it out there. It's out there. All right. I don't know why your author called it direct foreign investment. It's really called foreign direct investment. So I kept it there, but I want to give you the acronym FDI. That's what they're called, FDI, foreign direct investment. In global business, everywhere is what we call it. If you think about, we talked about Boeing, right? Who's Boeing's number one competitor in the world? Who else makes airplanes, right? Airbus. So Airbus is the other competitor to Boeing. It's a European consortium. Their airplanes are made in France. And so if you think about Airbus and you think like, oh, hold on, if you're an American company, you might be under pressure to buy Boeing, buy American, right? And if you're the American government even, and you have to buy a bunch of airplanes for the Air Force, you're going to want to buy Boeing because things are not going to go well for you as a politician if you buy, European brand. And so the way that Airbus was able to counter that is by, coming to the U.S. So here's Airbus U.S., where they thought, you know what we're going to do is what if we made airplanes in the United States? What if we decided to come to the U.S. and actually make airplanes in Alabama? And so they're, $300 million later, they're making the A220 jet in Alabama, which is purchased by a bunch of American, passenger companies, right? So that's called FDI. We benefit because the money comes here, the jobs come here, the factories are here, all the other companies that are tied to this company that sell them their products are here. It's fantastic. So it's a win-win for us. And it's good for Airbus because now they have access to the market. All right. So what are the threats and opportunities in the global marketplace? Right. So political consideration. Your author reminds us that nationalism is a big reason why there's a lot of political consideration for barriers, right? So intense nationalism can lead to difficulties. It's a sense of national consciousness that boosts the culture and interest of one country over those of another country. China, tends to be very nationalistic, very proud nationalistic country. And what does that mean? It means that if you want to invest in China, good luck. You're going to have to partner up with a Chinese company if you want access, right? The current regime, Xi Jinping, the leader of China, is trying to relax that a little bit, but a lot of American companies are finding it still extremely difficult to have a presence in China unless they partner up with a Chinese company. Cultural differences, obviously, is going to be a big one. I love watching foreign films. So if you watch a Mexican film, Iñárritu, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Iñárritu, he's a great director. And if you ever pay attention to the trailers and the credits at the end of the movie or even before, a lot of times when you watch this Mexican movie, you'll be surprised to see a big logo and it'll say something that the movie was sponsored in part by the Ministry of Culture of Mexico. And people are like, what is that? Well, the idea is that imagine Mexican teenagers who want to go to the movie theater and escape, right? They're going to watch a lot of American movies. They're going to watch, car chase and stuff like that. They might not be as interested in watching the Mexican movies, right? The local movies. And so what ends up happening is that the Mexican government, and by the way, this is basically present outside the United States in just about every country you can imagine, Italian, Spanish, etc. They want to protect their culture. And cinema is a key part of a country's culture. And the way they're going to do that is by having the government come up with some rules. I was told by a student before that in Italy, for example, there's a little town called Bari, and this person had once told me that in Bari you could watch American films once a week. I don't know if it's still true or not, but this was 20 years ago, where if a kid wanted to watch American movies, it was like on a Thursday, and otherwise they're going to watch an Italian movie, and that's it. So think of that as a barrier, and it's a barrier because the Italians want to protect their culture, which you can't blame them. So that's the cultural differences and how countries kind of protect that differently. And of course the economic environment, right? So some countries are really, really struggling. If you look at the GDP around the world and you find some of the poorest countries, right? Somalia is probably ranked at the bottom. There's a lot of Sudan, South Sudan. Eritrea is another one. Anyway, it's showing you that the economic development plays a huge role there as well in threats and opportunities. Multinational corporations. So if you think about big, huge multinationals, right, we tend to think about, earlier we mentioned McDonald's, think Walmart, they have a global footprint, etc., right? Corporations that move resources, goods, services, and skills around national boundaries without regard to country. Let's check this out. This is really cool. This is from 2018. Your author has it also in the book, but I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of an update. So these are 25 giant companies that are bigger than entire countries, right? So it's kind of an interesting little take on this where you can see that, there we go, Spotify, right, which is a Swedish company, in 2017, that company's revenue exceeded the gross domestic product of Mauritania. Netflix, right, more than Malta. Anyway, just kind of a way for people to really wrap their head around how big these multinationals truly are, right? They're ginormous, and their revenue are bigger than countries, right? And some of them are just really, really impressive, right? Anyway, you get the idea, right? We're starting to get into bigger economies right there. Paraguay GDP, Walt Disney, Bulgaria's GDP. You get the idea, right? And so, having said that, think about what that means in terms of leverage. Think about what that means in terms of power, where these multinationals a lot of times go into a country and get their way. Let's see. I think that's it for it. So I was trying to do this in 30 minutes. Apologies, 52 minutes. Again, I have a lot of hyperlinks, a lot of stuff in there if you want to mess with it. I just created this slide straight from your book. So hopefully you find it useful. I'll post it as soon as I can. The exam will be by Sunday, this week, midnight.